Welcome, this is Dennis at Credit Firm Inc. And today I hope to expose some truths to you around the FICO algorithm that the lenders are forced to use. And we're going to do that by debunking a lot of common myths and a lot of advice that you've Googled or you've heard or maybe even your lenders told you around the credit score and what to do and not to do. And we're going to debunk that today. But in the heart of debunking this is to really expose and show you and educate you how this FICO algorithm works, where these broken pieces are, and how we're going to navigate through that. So important. First of all, to qualify us a little bit, we've been doing this professionally since 2009 with 12 different locations throughout Texas and New Mexico, although we help families all over the country and continue. But locations that you might be familiar with in some areas pretty close to you if you're in Texas or New Mexico. I like to start with this. There's storms in life. I mean, no matter what we do, you can do everything perfect. There's going to be storms, whether that's a job loss, divorce, death, an accident, COVID, whatever the case is, storms happen, whether your fault or not. But in most cases, assuming we survive that storm, we pick up the pieces, we repair, we correct, and we move forward. And even in financial storms, like whether it's a divorce, a stupid decision we might have made, a job loss, whatever the case is, we pick up the pieces, we learn from it, we repair what we can, and we move forward. Or at least when it comes to the FICO algorithm, it was also designed to emulate that. Folks that might have had a financial storm, but they're doing better now, and statistically they would continue to do well, or at least that's how it was originally designed. This is one system that's now broken and no longer follows that sequence. It's almost like the gentleman in the picture here who is stuck in that riverbank, that mud, and he's trying to make progress, only to step back into 2 foot of mud, right? You ever been there? And you're just not making any progress. It's like being in a pit and you're trying to get out and you're working as hard as anybody else only to slide back down. And because of that, I think we found the scripture. A lot of companies have a mission statement. We have a mission scripture, Psalms 42, and this just reflects what it is we do and the niche of what we do so perfectly, I think. He lifted me out of the pit of despair, out of the mud and out of the mire. He set my feet on solid ground and steadied me as I walked along. Isn't that beautiful? And that's exactly what happens. So many families are stuck, even after the 7 years, because the system has kept them in such high rate, whether that's a high rate auto loan, and the vehicle never made the loan, or they're having to pay so much more than anybody else, or continue to rent as opposed to own. Because that system, they stay stuck only for that process to rinse and repeat, right? And so what we need to do is pull these guys out of that mud. And how are we going to do that? Well, we're going to expose the broken pieces of the FICO algorithm the lender is forced to use. In doing so, we're going to be able to find some solution, get them on steady ground, and help move them along. Again, today's credit system wasn't originally designed, and we're going to talk about that specifically. And most of the stuff that we're going to talk about today, you can't Google it, and you're not going to find it on YouTube, because most of the information that's out there is around the consumer scores, the monitoring scores, or the more updated FICO algorithms. Let's do this by debunking some myths, some fake news, bring some clarity to some conflicting information. Why are credits, but before we do, let's start with this. Why are credit scores that the consumer sees, that you see on your Credit Karma or your Experian app, or maybe your Credit Wise that your credit card company provides a score to you, why is that different than what the lender uses? Well, first of all, the lender uses FICO, right? We know that. However, more specifically, they use the FICO's models 2, 4, and 5, depending on which bureau that is, which is always all 3 bureaus. So they use all 3. FICO 2 for Experian, 4 for TransUnion, and 5 for Equifax. These algorithms are 21 years old. They're no longer doing what they were designed to do. That's emulate real statistics. So we will focus on that. And let's start with this. Myth number 1, you've probably heard of this. Medical does not hurt your credit. We'll talk about that here in a moment. Let's talk about myth number 2. We hear this all the time. A client might call us and they say, well, it was this, it's always something big. We're going to use repo for an example. There was this repo in my past about 5 years ago, and it's just killing me. I haven't been able to move forward since then. Or maybe it was this divorce, or maybe it was this foreclosure, or maybe it was this big credit card charge-off, whatever that is. Myth number 3, paying off bad debt can hurt your credit score. Have you heard that one? We hear it all the time. How about this one? The opposite. Paying off bad credit can help your credit score, right? So we're kind of, again, conflicting information, so we're going to throw both myths up here. Myth number 5, paying off installment credit early, like a car loan, will help your credit score. Myth number 6, my score dropped when I paid off my auto loan or my furniture loan or whatever that loan is. I paid it off. They closed the account, my score dropped. Myth number 7, pay extra payments each month on that credit card or whatever that account is, and that'll add more on-time payments to your credit. I don't know. Is it true? We're going to talk about it. Myth number 8, add more positive accounts to your credit, and this will help offset the negative. Makes sense? Is it true though? Myth number 9, credit cards and what balances to keep, how to work them. There is a ton of conflicting information on this, so I'm not about to list it. We're just going to bring some clarity around this. Myth number 10, you can't add payment history to your credit. You can't add time on the bureau. In other words, hey, I need to establish credit history. How do I establish history from the past forward? I don't know. We'll talk about that. So, again, let's debunk the FICO Classic. Why are we going to focus on the FICO Classic, which is 2, 4, and 5? This is what 100% of your mortgage lenders use, and still what 90% of all other lenders use. And you've seen them, Credit Karma, TransUnion even has their own monitoring. By the way, you can order your bureaus and scores from TransUnion personally, Experian specifically, or even Equifax. But they're still not going to be the same credit scores that your lender's pulling. And none of them reflect what the lender sees. And again, just a picture of different variations that, if you guys have been familiar with, have seen in different monitoring and apps. So again, so many different scores. Most all of these scores, by the way, are ranging the same from 350 to 850. So why would they be different? We're going to talk about that, but we can certainly see with each score kind of weighing heavily on different things, reading different code and factors. No wonder the mass confusion. FICO Classic, here's an example of a bureau score, 2 on Experian, Equifax version 5, and TransUnion version 4. Again, I want to talk about the scores that are going to make a difference, the scores that determine a yes or no when it comes to a loan. We've said this already in this presentation. FICO is designed to emulate real statistics. They basically lay code. FICO is not owned by the credit bureaus. They lay code on all the content within the credit bureau, taking a snapshot of what's on that credit bureau at that moment. All those factors to calculate that score. That score, which again, they've taken this statistically off of thousands and thousands of different loans to predict the likelihood of you paying a new loan on time. What is the risk factor in that? So important. Again, we talked about this, but I want to say it again. FICO and the credit bureaus are 2 different companies. Matter of fact, the FCRA governs reporting agencies like the 3 major credit bureaus, but nobody governs FICO. FICO seems to always get out and skirt under this because they said, hey, listen, our score is only as good as the content that the credit bureaus are reporting, so there's no sense in governing us. The FICO Classic is now over 21 years old. The government has not okayed any of the newer FICO versions. They've told them, FICO has come to the government-sponsored enterprises, the ones pushing the money out, and said, hey, listen, we have more accurate scores that are more accurate to real-time statistics. This one's outdated. They won't okay it. We're still stuck with the same one. Bottom line, guys, is it's broken. Different credit scores, I think this is important. And one of the things, too, that we're going to point out during this presentation are some of those differences. Not only are we going to debunk some of these myths we talked about, I think it's important to, what are some of the differences that one algorithm like my Credit Karma responds to versus the monitoring score? And some of those things are within inquiries. We'll talk about these along the way. But again, different algorithms score some of this different content differently. Settled and paid derogatory, credit card balances, how one score codes derogatory versus the other. And the biggest illusion out there that we hear folks say all the time, well, yeah, I get it, my lender scores are different, but it's, if my monitoring score goes up 40 points, well, then my lender score went up 40 points. And that's simply not true at all. That the movement up or down has no contribution in many cases, sometimes it does, to the lender score moving up or down. I've seen the monitoring score like Credit Karma drop 40 points and the lender score not move at all. It's responding to something completely different. I've seen the opposite. I've seen it jump 75 points and the lender score literally hit a ceiling. You'll see why here in a moment when I show you. So two areas we're going to focus on is payment history and utilization, but the credit score itself is made 40 to 45% out of payment history, 30 to 35% is credit card utilization, and then time on the bureau or history up to 15%, and mix of accounts up to 10%, new loans up to 10%, and of course inquiries up to 10%. Again, let's focus on payment history when we're talking about the FICO Classic, the lender score algorithms. Payment history is full of code. Okay, now imagine this. Every account on a person's credit bureau, FICO is coding that account not only individually, but each month that account has been live on a month-to-month basis. So that is a ton of code. That is a ton of information that it is deciphering through in that algorithm. When it looks at derogatory, now again, this is specific to the lender score, the FICO Classic. When it is coding derogatory, it codes all derogatory the same. For example, it could be a $25 medical collection. It could be a $45,000 repo. It could be a $5,000 charged off. And all the coding is the same. All right? So important. In other words, you'll hear me say this all the time. Derogatories are derogatory. There's no such thing as big or small. That has no impact on how the credit score codes it. Now, having said that, some of your newer consumer models, like the popular one FICO 8 or Advantage Score, this is not the case. It will code certain derogatories, certain lates, certain amounts differently versus one versus the other, right? But the FICO Classic, again, which 100% of your mortgage lenders use, codes it all the same. Doesn't matter if it's $25 or not, codes it the same. So, what makes the difference on how one of these derogatory affect the credit score more than the other? If it's not the dollar amount, if it's not the type, then what is it? Well, it's time. Oh, by the way, quick note, fun fact. So there is one thing that FICO does not look at and code the same as anything else. So there's an exception to this rule, and that's child support. It doesn't even see it. All right, fun fact there. So again, what's one thing? What makes one derogatory affect the score more than the other is time. The more recent that derogatory, the more effect it has on the credit score. Because of that, it tends to get tunnel vision. This is so important. So keep in mind, if FICO, remember the payment history with all the code, if FICO is looking at all that information from the perspective of when did it happen, then it's going to have a hard time. It's going to be looking at it as if it's staring down a tube. Make sense? All right. So in the picture here, I've got a picture of a tube, and those balls inside that tube are going to represent derogatory or credit in general. The front of that tube representing right now, and the end of that tube representing 7 years ago. Everything that's within 2 years and newer makes up to 75% of the history part of the credit score, which is almost half. So this tube representing payment history. Everything that is 1 year old and newer is making up to 75% of that 75%. So progressively more impact, the newer the derogatory is. So important, which means this, that anything that's over 2 years old and newer is only making up to 25% of the overall credit score unless, of the history part of the credit score unless. So very important. Now, why do I say tunnel vision? Again, imagine if you're staring down the end of this tube. You're going to have a hard time seeing past that most recent derogatory. So in other words, you could be worrying about all this stuff in the, hey, well, what about this and this and this? And yes, we want this old stuff in the past taken care of, but if we don't take care of what's in front of that tube, it's like FICO doesn't even see it. So important. We see people that have used credit repair companies. They're like, well, they got this off and they got that off, and we negotiated to pay for deletion on this, and it doesn't matter. FICO can't see past that most recent ones that they didn't get off. Right? So important. So how does FICO Classic age that derogatory? Well, it should age it based on when it actually happened, right? I mean, that's how it was designed, and that would certainly make sense. And of course, given the fact that this represents 45% of the overall credit score, and which is payment history, and 75% of payment history is based on when did it happen, it would seem ludicrous that FICO wouldn't age these derogatory correctly, but of course that's the situation that we're going to talk about right now. It's certainly not the way it's supposed to. And it ages different types of derogatory differently, which we're going to debunk today and talk about today. The actual age of the account that FICO ages it can differ greatly than when it actually happened. This is so important. Now again, some of your newer algorithms have corrected this issue, but FICO Classic certainly has not. That in itself is going to be a giant difference and a giant reason you can see a difference between your monitoring or your consumer scores, your FICO 8, your Credit Karma, versus the lender scores. And that's based on how they age the derogatory. All the other factors seem to be very similar. Again, FICO designed to emulate real statistics. If we go back to the tube example, person could have had a storm 4 years ago, but they've been doing good since, so statistically they would continue to do well. It would seem nuts to consider FICO aging an account any different than when it actually happened, especially when we consider how it scores and codes your credit overall. Big difference that we see is when it comes to collection agencies. FICO Classic, or collections in general, FICO Classic ages that debt based on when the collection agency purchased it. So important. Could have happened 5 years ago. That company sells it off to a third-party collection agency, brings it back to the front of the tube. This alone could make 75-point difference in a person's credit score. Then it starts getting older, and then they sell it again to a new third-party collection agency. And this debt just seems to keep making its way back to the front. Another giant mistake, glitch, broken or not, or done on purpose, I don't know. Another giant difference between the classic scores and the newer algorithms is when it comes to paying off an old collection. FICO, the coding on the account never changes, but the date of last activity does. So this account could be 4 years old, you can pay it off, and oftentimes it will bring it back to the front As a result, dropping the credit score. Best case scenario, it does nothing to the credit score if you pay it off. Most of the time, it will drop the credit score, again, depending on the original age of that debt and a combination of other factors. Another big difference is when it comes to charged off accounts. With that, a company still owns the account that's charged off and they have not sold it and they're updating that each month. This will cause an error in that score in the way it's properly aging that account. We'll talk about these things a little more specifically. Before we go into more specific how FICO ages, let's now talk about positive credit versus negative credit. So important. Now, I want you to take in this example, I want you to take aging the account out of the factor here. We're just going to consider positive versus negative and how that weighs out and compares to each other within the scoring algorithm. FICO, if that jar, we'll use this jar as an example, if that jar represented payment history or their overall credit score, if you could see that account, I'll zoom in here. Credit services, this account, notice the nines that are rolling across here. Each month that account is showing outstanding, it's rolling another 9. Now this is a derogatory account, and that coding, again, like I told you earlier, FICO looks at it from a month-to-month perspective. Each one of those 9s, imagine that being like throwing 9 red beans into the jar, just for each 9 that you see. So that one account alone could be a ton of red beans. Now imagine a lot of our clients have a ton of negative accounts that are doing the same thing, so you can imagine this jar would fill up with red beans in a hurry. Okay? Now let's compare that to a positive account. Let's here, and we'll zoom in again. Notice this account has 1s. For every on-time payment or every month that account is current, FICO codes it as a 1. This is the equivalent of 1 green bean within that jar of red, right? So again, we're comparing negative versus positive only. We're not considering age in this example. Customer they tell me this all the time. Well, I pay 2 extra payments on my account, so each month, I'll pay it down and then pay another one, or I'll pay an extra payment every month. Well, that's great, but they say it from the perspective of it'll give me an extra on-time payment each month. This is what I've read and heard. And I said, well, I've heard the same thing, but it certainly doesn't. This is what it gives you: 1 on-time payment. Remember, that what we call a payment, a current payment on each account that rolls, is actually just the status of the account that month, that particular month. So it's current. So you can't become more current than current that month. So same as one regular on-time payment. Client says, well, I paid that account completely off. Let's say it's a car loan. Great. That should jump my credit score. Well, that's equivalent of 1 on-time payment. Client says, well, I paid the account off early. Great. This is all great. It's great to be debt-free. It's not doing much to the credit score. It's the same as 1 on-time payment, right? So you can see the idea of saying, hey, I want to open a lot of extra accounts to offset my negative. This is going to be a long process, especially with some of the aging issues that I told you about earlier. And some of the stuff out there that you hear, again, paying extra payments and all that. Again, it's good idea to get out of debt and to save yourself on interest, but to do it for the purpose that you think it's helping your credit score, it certainly isn't. Now, one of the big factors too, when you add a bunch of extra loans, so if that's your plan in, well, we're going to add a lot of these positive trade lines, again, to offset the negative. Well, now you got a whole nother consequence, because FICO will penalize you for too many new loans at once. And it'll penalize you for one new loan if you haven't had a similar loan within the last 24 months, right? So not a good idea to do it this way. Now, let's focus on utilization. Again, makes up to 30 or 35% of the overall credit score. So this is a huge piece of the pie. And we're going to focus our attention on how the lender scores. The FICO Classic looks at utilization. Utilization, you should know this. If not, I'll tell you real quick. Looks at the percentage between the limits versus the balances. In the example here, we have 3 cards with $1,000 limits apiece, so you have 3,000 total limits. For easy math, the balances on each one of these cards is $300. So a total of balances of $900. Utilization is 30%. You're utilizing 30% of the limits you have available. This is how FICO calculates that. Now, again, let's talk about, I know there's a lot of conflicting information around this. We're gonna discern through that right now. That makes up to 35% of the overall credit score. Now, I hear this all the time. Well, what gets you the most points? What's the ideal balance, Dennis, to get the most points out of my credit card? 5% on at least one of your majors. The rest can be 0 and have at least a 5% or less, not 0, on one major credit card. A lot of content I've been hearing lately is saying it doesn't matter if you have 5% or if they're all zeroed out. Yes, it does on the lender scores. It'll be a 15 to 20 point difference on a person that has 0 balances on the credit score, because whether they've just haven't used them in a long time or they pay them to 0 each month, versus having at least one of those cards, even if it's just a $5 balance, will make another 15 to 20 point difference in the positive direction if they would just simply do that. So how do you do that? Just whatever you use, pay everything off but $5 each month, and you're safe, right? Okay. Maxed accounts. I think this is important. So we talked about the utilization, like in this example, $3,000 worth of limits, $900 worth of balances, 30% utilization. However, if any one of those individual cards were maxed out, and let's just say that the overall utilization was still good, it will double hit you. It will hit you specifically for that one account that is maxed out. So important, right? So I've seen this happen all the time. Well, I keep all these high limits alone, and this card's the one I use on a regular basis. Maybe it pays me rewards. I don't know what the reasoning is sometimes when folks do this. But that card being maxed out is double whacking the score, even though your overall utilization might be good. We see score jumps in this way. We tend to see when it's 50%, 25%, and 5%. Anything under 25% is considered good. Once again, 5% and less is optimum, but that in those levels is where you'll tend to see the scores jump. Maybe they're jumping from bad to not as bad and then moving on into good to excellent. Secured credit cards is a great way to establish credit, revolving credit, if a person's unable to qualify for a credit card on their own. And then authorized user is another way to, and we'll talk about this in more detail, but is another way that you can have somebody add you to their credit card. We have folks that a list of folks that we can add you to, or your customers to a credit card with high limits, perfect payment history, and small balances to really optimize that utilization. Whether we're needing it because a client simply doesn't have a credit card or utilization history, and this alone would probably get their scores where they need to get qualified, or maybe we're using it to help offset some of their higher balances on their current credit card utilization. Now, we're going to talk about one of the biggest differences in the FICO Classic score versus the newer corrected, updated consumer scores, monitoring scores, however you want to label them. And that's when it comes to a charged off credit card, all right? So this is a charged off credit card. This credit card company is not sold to a third party collection agency, just like we see these often where they don't. They still own it and it's charged off. This is so huge. Matter of fact, it might be one of the biggest variables between the scores. It can also be one of the easiest and quickest ways to jump a person's credit score if they're coming in short to get qualified for a home or whatever that purchase they're looking at. And I promise you can't Google this. So back to our chart on the right hand side this time. Same chart. Client has 3 cards with $1,000 limits. Each one of them has $300 balance for easy math. We all agreed that was 30% utilization. $900 versus $3,000 worth of limits. Let's say that same client had a charged off credit card in their past. 5 years ago, doesn't matter. And that charged off credit card, they charged off $3,000. By the time they rolled in their penalties and interest and all that, it's a charged off $3,000 balance. So same chart, 3 cards that they have now. They're paying perfect. They're keeping their utilization good. They're paying everything on the time. They're trying to do everything right. But that credit card in their past of $3,000 is actually averaged into their current right now utilization. So instead of this person having $900 worth of balances against $3,000 worth of limits at 30% utilization, the algorithm, the classic, actually will calculate $3,900 against, they don't use the old limit, against the open right now $3,000 worth of limits, which means instead of 30% utilization, we're closer to 130% utilization. That alone could create a 60 to 100 point difference in the score between the FICO classics, the lender scores, and your newer FICO models. That huge? That's huge. So let's get back to those 10 myths we talked about earlier, and let's debunk based on what we've learned so far. So myth number 1, medical collections, do they hurt your credit? You know, we hear this all the time. Lenders say this, mortgage lenders, well, we don't use medical against you. And they don't. They don't use it against your debt to income. However, they use your credit score when it comes to qualifying you for that loan. And medical collections absolutely affect the credit score the same as everything else. So that is false. Myth number 2, you know, this repo from 5 years ago is what's killing my score, or some other larger debt. Again, we hear this all the time. I had this horrible thing happen to me 4, 5, 6 years ago, and that's the reason why today my score still stinks. Probably not, because again, the older that debt, the less impact it has on your current credit score. So there's probably something else, unless it's doing some of that jerky stuff that I showed you earlier. Myth number 3, paying off bad debt can hurt your credit score. Hey, this is mostly false or true. It absolutely can hurt your credit score if you pay off that old debt, as it can make it newer. But there's exceptions to that rule. So, number 4, same question, but turned around, is there's accounts that you can settle, old bad accounts in your past that you can settle, and it'll absolutely help your credit score. And one of those being a charged off credit card that's updating every month. Now, get some help on this before you just start blindly paying this stuff off, and let us show you which one of those accounts are. Myth 5, paying off an old installment credit early, like a car loan or furniture loan or a signature loan, will actually help your credit score. And that is false. We talked about that. It's just going to treat it like one on-time payment. Myth number 6, my scores dropped when I paid my loan off. I hear this all the time with Credit Karma. They say, man, my scores just dropped 40 points. I said, you know, we're looking, and said the only thing that's happened is they paid off their auto loan or their an installment loan. This is simply not true. That is just that algorithm penalizes for all closed accounts, including installments, and anytime you pay off an installment, it's always going to go to closed. The real scores are not doing that. That's one good thing about the classics. Myth number 7, pay extra payments each month, and that'll add positive payment history much faster to my credit. This is false, right? Remember this, because when the credit bureau is posting what we call an on-time payment, it's really just the status of that account on that particular month. Is it current? Is it 30 days late? Is it 60 days late? What is it? Add more positive accounts to offset the negative. Seems to make sense, right? Hey, the more positive accounts that'll pay, that'll offset the negative, but we know that's simply not true. It's a very slow process to try to offset it, and typically you're going to be penalized a lot harder than the benefits you're going to get from the on-time payments, at least for the first 6 to 12 months. Myth number 9. We talked about a lot of the different conflicting information. We exposed some truth around that. And just to quickly reflect, 5% is optimum when it comes to getting the most points out of your credit cards. And we also talked about something that you rarely hear about, and that's having an individual account maxed out and how it can double hit your credit outside of the normal utilization factor. Myth number 10, you can't add payment history to your credit. And we touched on this, I gave you a little hint earlier. So how would you do this? How without just living longer life, how do I add time on my bureau or history to my bureau? That's with an authorized user. That's what's so beautiful about an authorized user. If somebody has 5 years worth of history, perfect payment history on this credit card, and they add you to it, that history is going to retro and stamp onto your credit file in most cases. Now, today's authorized users, they don't always show on all 3 reports. They might only hit 1. Sometimes they don't hit any. But if you need one, we have them that will. All right. So that is false. Here's a bonus myth. You must have a lot of previous debt to have a great credit score. You needed to have a lot of paid off stuff in your history and all these things. And Dave Ramsey, you are wrong. You can absolutely be debt free. You could become debt free. You could start debt free and never had any debt in your past, and absolutely have a wonderful credit score and maintain a wonderful credit score by continuing to be debt free. And that's just simply open up a credit card and keep it open. Keep a small, if you want to get the most points, keep a $5 balance. If that bothers you, fine. Keep it at 0. Just keep it open. That's going to hit 2 major parts of your credit score. It's going to hit payment history. That's going to hit utilization. That covers 75% of the credit score, which is more than enough to get you well into the 700s. Might not get into the 800s, which might take some mix of accounts to do that, but who cares? You're still an A+ credit score. So again, Dave, you're wrong about that. All right. And I love Dave Ramsey, by the way, so don't get me wrong on that one. Another bonus myth. Conventional credit repair doesn't work. This is true. Look, here's the thing. You've heard of these companies, these licensing law firms. I mean, Google credit repair and they'll pop up all over the place. Matter of fact, y'all probably think that we're quote unquote credit repair, and we do credit repair. But we're way more specific than that. But the reason the conventional credit repair doesn't work is simply what we've talked about before, is if they don't get the right derogatory, or they don't stop some of the old derogatory from coming out back from the past, then it's not going to move the score. And today's credit repair companies are only getting between 25 and 45% of the derogatory off, right? So again, unless it's the ones in the front and they don't stop the old stuff from selling back, FICO doesn't see past the score. They're coming to the lender 18 months later, or they come to us. Well, we were with this credit repair company for a year and a half, spent all this money with them, and still can't get approved for a house. Yeah, I understand, because of these reasons that we've talked about so far. Now, seems to be 3 major industries around debt resolution, and that's credit repair, of course. That's debt settlement companies. And that's these companies that you're seeing pop up that are adding trade lines. Hey, add your rent history, add your utilities, add this secured loan, add this authorized user, adding all these trade lines, right? Debt settlement companies, it's not a great idea because they settle everything. And they're settling accounts that actually hurts the credit score if you settle it. And it's a long, drawn-out process. They're charging you a ton of money to do it. It's a terrible thing. Credit repair, again, just disputing items. It's almost like every one of these companies is almost like handing a 4-year-old a hammer. Everything becomes a nail. And here's the thing. There is a time and place for each one of those things. There is a time and place when credit repair is a great strategy. Now, not just the disputes. Like us, we use several different methods to get the negative off. There is a place when debt settlement makes sense, but not everything. Just specific accounts that would make sense to settle. And there's situations where adding the right trade line would make sense. Well, we're experts in all 3 of those industries, but using them specifically to the client's situation, to their budget, to their timeline, And again, more specifically to what's going on with their credit. Debt settlement makes sense on this, credit repair makes sense on this, adding an authorized user here, boom, we're able to come up with their credit score in a very reasonable time period and usually very reasonable financially. And so it just works when we understand the algorithm and we have the tools in place to do this. We say it all the time, they're all home buyers. Every customer you meet, regardless of their credit situation, they're all home buyers, at least on the credit side now. Hope that blesses you. Listen, if you want more information or you need somebody to help walk you through this specifically, or one of your customers through this process specifically, our consultation is free. It is not a sales presentation. We're going to be able to put an exact plan together, show you what to do, and if you want us to do it for you, then of course you can always hire us. Talk to you soon.